I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the key elements of the business plan. It really is very clear why the business plan is so important. It's your calling card, it's your first entry in, it's the start of the conversation, it's the start of the investment process. And the experience that we have with CTI PFAN is that you won't get very far without it. Just to give you some idea, people like Michael, the VC, the private equity funds, they receive business plans week in, week out. The bank's the same. When I was working in a bank, you receive thousands of applications. People know you have money, you're attractive, people want to talk to you. The question for you as an investor, as a banker, is how do you get to those projects that you want to invest in that meet your requirements, that meet your hurdle rates? And the business plan helps you do that. The advantage that the CTI PFAN process brings to you is that having gone through this vetting procedure, having gone through the coaching procedure, that when the business plan hits Michael's desk or Sylvia's desk, in her last 17 years with the Deutsche Bank, not perhaps so much now, they know that your business plan is worth looking at. The business plan is also about sort of moving from the planning stage to the implementation stage. The proposals that we receive, and I think Bobby mentioned this morning that we have somewhere in the region of 200 projects in our development pipeline at the moment. Most of those on the mitigation, relatively few on adaptation. But these are some of the features that those proposals exhibit. Too much technology, picking up a point that Michael made. The data that is presented to us is poorly organized, and there's too much of it. The feature, the thing that came up in the discussions this morning, very much is data overload, and the data that is there is not well organized. You have limited time and space to get your messages across. No ask. I think that became very apparent during the presentations today. If you don't ask, you won't get. And this group of sort of people that you're talking to, investors and bankers, they need to be asked very specifically and explicitly. They need to know exactly what you're asking for, how much, whether it's equity, whether it's debt, what sort of equity it is, and what they're going to get in return for that investment. I think it's also clear from the presentations that we saw this morning that there's not enough financial data and information in your presentations and in your business plans. And that which there is poorly organized. It doesn't relate necessarily to the assumptions that you're making. It's inconsistent and poorly presented. So the construction of the financial model, the way you present it, is very, very important. It needs to be a central feature of the business plan. It needs to relate and correlate to all the other bits of the business plan and the assumptions that you're making. I think we also see that there's a lack of focus on the critical success factors that really make the project successful and are going to enable the project execution. And that was really the object of the exercise this morning during the course of today, to look at the projects, to get you to think about your projects and to understand who are the suppliers and what your cost structures are, what the revenue streams are, what your business model is, and as a result of that, where your weaknesses are currently and where your key strengths are that you need to still build on and can build on to persuade the investor that you're an investment opportunity. And I think the last not least one, risks. None of us like admitting to the risk in the project, but we need to address them head on, and we need to have good mitigation strategies to deal with them. So this is the real value of the business plan, to help us move from this mindset of planning to implementation, and to address the obstacles and the challenges head on that we're going to face in executing and delivering the project. And it's the starting point of the investment and investment dialogue. Just to reinforce that, what we asked you to do in the CTI PFAN process is to produce 3 related documents. The business plan document, we'll go through a number of drafts, an executive summary. We'll come back to look at this later, but I'd emphasize that the executive summary is not an introduction to the business plan. I think it was a point that Michael also made. It's a summary of the business plan. It's the small 3-page teaser that you send to the investor to get the interest to read the business plan and to look at the other documents. And what we also ask you to do is to produce a project data sheet. We'll come back to that a little bit later to explain exactly what that is. And also for those of you that present at the forum, an investor pitch presentation, which is, if you like, the first interaction with the investor, you standing in front of a group of investors and selling your wares and pitching your project. And these 3 components are the key deliverables of the CTIP-FAN methodology and development of your project going forward. The objectives of the business plan really, I think can always be encapsulated in 7 very simple questions. Who, what, why, where, how, what if, and when. It's the one I've missed. If you answer all those questions in a factual, concise, and precise manner, you will have a good business plan. Some of the questions aren't quite as obvious as they seem. The who is important. There are many there are many investors that can only invest in certain sorts of project developers. So if you're a limited company, you'll be open to some investors. If you're an NGO, or if you're a consortia or a joint venture or some other form of entity, you might not be eligible for a particular form of investment. The idea of partners in who is an important concept and something that we discussed at the table in my group this morning. Partners is a dangerous concept. It's very useful to describe somebody that we're working with, but we need to know the exact contractual relationships with those partners. Are they suppliers? Are they off-takers? What is the nature of the off-take? Are they supporting the project by providing other resources? And if so, what are the terms of those relationships? Is it costing me something? Am I getting something for free? It's very rarely a free lunch, as we all know. So just to list for you the key elements, the section headings, if you like, of the business plan that we at CTIP-FAN feel must be in your business plan. And what I'm going to do in the rest of the presentation is talk through some of those sections and give you a little bit more detail on them. I won't go through them all. I'll sort of leave them there for you to absorb for a minute. The value proposition. We've talked a lot over the course of the day about the value proposition. And there are 2 components to the value proposition. The first one is the sort of internal value that you're generating in doing the business and implementing the project that you're proposing. And that, of course, is very important to you. But the value proposition that we're really trying to get you to focus on is your value to the investor. What are you bringing him? How are you enabling him to make his or her money and return the investment with the agreed returns at the end of the investment period? Why should the investor invest in your project? And these are the things that you need to be thinking about as you have your discussions with the coaches and develop the business, the structure of your business, the structure of your project, and start putting the business plan together. Very important is to know in this equation what investor you're targeting. And I think Michael mentioned as well that there are a number of different sorts of investors out there, and they all have different requirements. And with your coach, with your other advisors, I can recommend that you, over the next months, focus in on this question of which investor am I speaking to? Am I speaking to a DFI, a development finance institution? Am I speaking to a venture capitalist or a bank? And they all have slightly different requirements. To help you with that process, we've put together this slide. I call it the project development profile, to really help you identify where you are in the project development process. And this is one way, and there are several, of looking and identifying which investors you're likely to be targeting. On the left, we have the start of the project concept, your idea, the birth of whatever you're doing, and you move forward in stages through pre-feasibility, technical feasibility, commercial feasibility to full implementation. Now this is artificial, it's for the purposes of demonstration. I'm not saying that all projects move like this, but it's a useful way of seeing where you are, working out, I'm doing my pre-feasibility study, I'm working out whether the thing can work, and if I need money at that stage, who can I talk to? And at that pre-feasibility stage, you're probably looking at more of your own money, unfortunately. You're looking at sweat equity, unfortunately going without pay yourself, looking at raising investment for friends and family, perhaps angel investors, if and to the extent they exist in your markets. And as you go through the investment process and the development process, you get more commercial and you can start looking at financial institutions and banks towards the end. So that's one way of working out where you are on the development profile and what sort of investor you might be targeting. Another way, very useful, and it's certainly something that I would advise you doing, is to look at the returns that your project is likely to generate based on the assumptions that you're working on. And once you've identified that, and this is why it's so important, you can also home in on the investors that you're talking to, or you're likely to be talking to. Again, this is not an exact science. I've given you ranges here of the sort of returns and the sort of investors that you might be talking to as a result. And all of these investors have different requirements and different ways of dealing with the project proposal, the business plan as it comes into them, and accordingly you need to structure and target your business plan accordingly. And that leads us to the importance of the business model. Now, again, we talked about this during the course of the group discussions this morning and this afternoon, and I'm not trying to be rude, but I don't think of all the projects that we saw today that I saw one properly communicated business model. A lot of you had a slide that said, this is my business model, and then showed an organogram of how the company was structured or the way the divisions worked. That is not the business model, at least not for me. The business model is how you use your inputs to add value and sell your service or product to a client or a customer that pays for them. And not only do it one time, but do it multiple times. And that sounds a very banal statement, but it's a very, very important statement, because only if you have a model that enables you to do that and repeat that process many, many times are you capable of moving to scale. And again, that's something else that we were talking about this morning, this idea of moving to scale, the scalability and replication of your projects. And again, this is something that the investors are looking for. If you've got that methodology built into your projects, that you do something once, 100 times, 1,000 times, or 10,000 times, then you have a robustness in your project that is attractive to investors, and they can start thinking about a serious investment proposition. And it's about the contractual agreements that you have embedded in the project structure. The way I like to think about it, and just to sort of give you an idea, is you've got the supply side, your supply agreements, whether it's biomass, whether it's supply of equipment, or transportation and logistics on the one side. On the other side, you've got the demand, the offtake, whether it's a power purchase agreement in the case of energy, or delivering an agricultural product to a market, as we've had many, many times today. That's the demand and a payment for it. And in the middle, you've got the technology, which brings them all together and enables you to deliver that product to the market and make money at it. In putting this together, your objective is to gain the investor confidence that you need and they need to be able to proceed with looking at your project and reading the business plan. Again, reflecting a key point that Michael brought up, the management and manpower. It's about demonstrating your ability to execute the project. It's not so much a question of listing, who's doing what and what positions they are. I've got a CEO, I've got a project manager, an administration manager. That having a structure to your personnel is of course important, but it's more about showing their credentials and track record, the ability to deliver the project on the one hand, and also knowing where you've got weaknesses, the need to train personnel or how you're going to source those personnel should you need them. And I think some of you mentioned that this morning in the presentations, and that's very important. The balance of the team. Have you got all the commercial skills you require? Have you got the technical skills you require and the managerial skills? And the reality of the presentations and the proposals that we see is that very often there's good technology skills, there's good general management skills, but the commercial and the financial management is often missing. And if that's so, it needs to be addressed in some way or other. Please avoid the generic diagram. CEO, project manager, account manager. It's pretty meaningless. Industry and market analysis. All the work that we've done with investors and banks indicate to us that those project developers who demonstrate a strong understanding of their market and the key drivers of that market do better and are viewed more favorably. Part of that is understanding your competition, who your competition is, whether there's competition out there, and particularly if you're using new technologies, whether that technology creates an entry barrier for other competitors, or whether there are other developments out there which might lead to a wholesale change in the way things are done and is a threat to your business. And of course, one way of sort of approaching this is the SWOT analysis. There are various other ways of looking at this, the Porter's 5 forces analysis, and so on and so forth. Technology. I don't want to spend too long here. Just to really reinforce the point, it doesn't really help us to have a long description on technology. Yes, we need to know what technology you're using. We need to know that it works in the application that you're proposing. More important to us are the implications on the business model itself of that technology choice. What's it going to cost you? What are the operating costs? What are the operating costs in terms of the personnel you need to support it? What are the maintenance costs, and so on and so forth? And we need to see those correlate into your financial model, and that the assumptions there are the same as the ones that you use actually in the financial model. Often they're not, strangely enough. It's also interesting to know how you chose that technology. Did you go out to a competitive tender? Are you getting a good price for it? How much research did you do on choosing that technology? And what are the other options? Here, keep it short and all the detail in the annexes. Or save it for later. You don't need to put it in there up front. It's something that you can then say, okay, once we get into the investment discussion, I can bring it out and present it to the investor. Operations and logistics. Particularly, I think, for many of the projects around the tables today, operations and logistics extremely important. All biomass, all renewable projects certainly have a big logistics component. And I don't think it was at all well addressed, I'm afraid to say, in any of the projects that presented today. Now, I know it's unfair in the 10 minutes to expect you to go into details of all your logistical arrangements, but the reality is that if you can't find a way of addressing that aspect of your project in a short period of time, firstly in your pitch, then in your business plan and the executive summary, to give the investor confidence that you have taken care of how you're getting your feedstock to your processing plant, or in the case of the agricultural produce, how you're getting your produce from the growing point to the customer and to the market, they're not going to look at you very long. So this is extremely important. And again, it's another area which has a significant and absolutely critical impact on the money, on the financials, and whether it works and whether it doesn't work from a commercial point of view. So the investment structure. Now, I think all of us, however much we deal with this, we tend to struggle with putting the investment structure together. But we need to do it, and it needs to come upfront and explicitly within the ask. We need to understand very clearly what amount of money you're looking for, whether it's debt or equity. If it's equity, what sort of equity and what sort of returns it's being required on. The whole question of valuation is incredibly important here. And a sense of reality and in that proposal that you make is extremely important. I don't know how many times a project developer has said, I need $1 million. I've got $30,000 of my own money in there. And okay, I've done 2 years of work on it, and I want 95% of the company if you give me the other 970,000. It's not going to happen. Be realistic, but that valuation, that proposal needs to be in there, because it again is the start of the negotiation. And if it's not in there, as an investor, I don't have the context to start that negotiation, and I don't have the incentive to start that negotiation. I think it's very important to show exactly how the project has been funded to date. How much of your own money has gone into it, where other funding sources have come in, whether you've been able to raise grants, whether you've got other investors motivated to come in, whether it's your friends, your family, other angel investors. That's a vital piece of information. If other investors have come in, that's a great sign of credibility for your project. The thing that I would advise you to look at and consider using in that connection is the source and application of funds. It's a very simple way of saying, on the left-hand side, this is where my money is coming from the various sources. This is the amount of money that I've put in myself, and this is where it's being used. It's an opening balance sheet, if you like. It's very clear. I understand immediately what your contribution is, what my expected contribution is, how it all works, and where the money is being used. And it's probably saved me about 2 or 3 pages of text just by putting it in that simple table. I often say that money is a binary commodity. You have it or you don't have it. And unfortunately, the reality of the situation is that the people that do have it, in this case the investors and the bankers, will always dictate the terms on which you get it. That's simple market force and rules, and of course there's a negotiation in there, but that's the way it is, and it's best to accept that and work within those parameters. Exit strategy. Don't mention the IPO route unless you really are an IPO candidate. But we need to know how you propose exiting this, unless we're talking perhaps about a debt financing. But then we're looking about repayment over the period, and it's a self-liquidating mechanism, if you like. There are, particularly in the areas of perhaps hydro, and some of the projects that we're looking at here, situations where the project can be run as a long-term annuity almost, on a cash flow basis. The financial analysis, and again, this is something that I think we all struggle with in finding the formula. I mean, I think it's one thing knowing how to create the spreadsheet, but then trying to present it sensibly and concisely in the business plan. It's actually relatively simple, I think, or can be simple. First, you create the model, you encode it into a spreadsheet, and please give us the spreadsheet. We want the original spreadsheet. We don't want PDF copies of it. We want to be able to see the formulae. There's nothing more frustrating than getting a spreadsheet that has all the formulae hidden. We can work out probably as well as anybody else can what the formulae should be, but it takes us a lot longer, and it's frustrating. And why should I do that? Make the life of the investment officer easier rather than more difficult. And I think it's very rare that is there any really real proprietary or confidential information embedded in those spreadsheets. Very, very few occasions have I ever seen that. Once you've created that and provided as an annex, then just briefly in the introduction to your financial section, say how it's constructed. Say the spreadsheet is formulated of 5 lines of A, B, C, D, E resulting in, and then on the second sheet we have the cash flow analysis. On the third sheet we have the financial ratio analysis. Just helps the person that's sitting there looking at it navigate and look at the spreadsheet, understand it and use it. And essentially what they're going to do, I'm not sure that Michael mentioned this, is probably take your numbers and either start playing with them or feed them into their own models and play with them accordingly. But to be able to do that, they've got to understand your numbers in the first place. Once you've done that, very simply just summarize the outputs. Determine the ratios, the margins, and the financial data that are useful and relevant to your projects. If you're looking for debt, then you're probably going to be more usefully looking at the EBIT or EBITDA figures. If you're looking at an equity ask, then the equity IRR, project IRR's return on equity information is going to be more useful. Some projects both. A project IRR is a useful indicator for all of us. But if you're looking for equity, please also provide an equity IRR rather than just the project IRR. It's not terribly relevant to all of us here. If there's a carbon finance element, by all means include it or show that it's there. But I think certainly in the present market, it's not really going to make too much difference. And the attitude of everybody is that they're going to take it out. So they're going to look at your business plan on a naked, before carbon finance basis. And if it doesn't work without the carbon finance, then you probably haven't got a deal. Risks. Now, I think it's very important that you create a comprehensive risk catalogue. That risk catalogue should address the likelihood of a risk occurring and the impact of that risk if it does occur. It can be very simple. Likelihood low, risk or impact of the occurrence high. And identify all the risks. Now, you probably don't want to put all of those risks, which is going to be quite a long list at the end of the day, in the business plan. But the chief ones, the 3 or 4 really important risks, we do want to see in the business plan. Those risks that are going to put you out of business. In the biomass examples that we've seen today, perhaps the greatest risk to your business is a disturbance, a serious disturbance in the supply of biomass. What happens if the supply of biomass in any particular year through a climate-related incident falls by 50%? Might seem unlikely, but it's going to have a very, very high impact on your business. Some risks may only be capable of partial mitigation, or you might not have an answer for them at all, but at least list them. Again, I think the experience of all investors is that if you've identified the risk, the likelihood of you being able to deal with it, should it occur, we don't want it to occur, but should it occur, is much greater than if you haven't thought about it at all. Critical success factors we talked about a little bit earlier. The critical success factors are probably going to relate to your greatest risks. So the things that you have to get right to make your business function well are going to be those things that, if they go wrong, are going to be the greatest risks. And again, I've given the biomass example there. I think this is a repetition to some extent, sensitivity analysis. Once you've got your financial model, once you've determined what the risks are, then you can model the impact on some of those risks. But please model the risks that you've identified as being the greatest risks. If you've identified the greatest risk as being the supply of biomass or your crop failing in a year and your crop production reducing by 50%, don't then model a risk of a 5% inflation increase, because that's irrelevant or can be irrelevant. So make sure you model the things that are relevant to your projects and those things which actually threaten your project the greatest. Project impacts, I think this was an area that everybody handled extremely well in the presentations. There was good data and good numbers. The more numbers, the better. Gives us confidence. Please make sure the numbers are consistent. Often we find that there are sort of different numbers in the introduction or the executive summary to the rest of the business plan, and that lack of consistency then gives us pause for doubt and concern. But I think it is important to bring these other impacts in, not just the financial impacts and the financial benefits, and to quantify them as much as possible. Finally, a closing summary. You do need to have an ending. Although it's not a novel, we do need an ending. We do need to know that the business plan has finished. And I suggest you do that simply by summarizing your project highlights very briefly, making a recommendation for why the investor should invest, and underlining the benefits. Again, it doesn't have to be more than 2 sentences, but we know it's finished then. The executive summary is a separate document. It's not the introduction to your business plan. It can include certainly sections of the business plan in a slightly shorter form or in a one-to-one form. You don't have to find different language to put in the executive summary. If a particular section of the business plan is important and needs to be in the executive summary for any particular reason, copy-paste it in. At the end of the day, your executive summary should be 2 to 3 pages maximum, and it should have all the relevant data in a compressed form to enable me to say, yes, I want to read the full business plan. But please, a separate document, and not as an introduction and then the business plan. The business plan should have its own introduction, which briefly describes the project. The project data sheet. This is something that we have developed with some of our investors. They actually suggested that we do it, and it's essentially an Excel spreadsheet that really extracts the key data, the hard data from your business plans and puts it in almost a sort of a one-side Excel sheet summary, and enables us to collect and collate information on the one hand, but more importantly, it's an instrument that we use to access and go out to investors with. And they like it in this form because they can plug it straight into their models. It's clear by now that you need to know what you want before you put pen to paper and put your ideas down. And it's important to be explicit and concise. And it could be, I think, we found this frequently, you might end up writing a number of slightly different business plans for different investors. Obviously the basic information and assumptions will be the same, but they'll be using slightly different language because you're talking to an impact investor in one hand and a risk investor on another hand. And that certainly works. Other resources that you can consider using, listed some here for you. There's a very, very good UNFCCC publication called, the actual title is a little bit longer than that. It's essentially a guide to preparing project proposals for financing. CTIP helped UNFCCC prepare that some time ago. It's available for downloading. There are various versions of it. There are different language versions of it. It's available in Portuguese, Spanish, English, French, Chinese, Russian, and a few other languages, if I remember correctly. And it also has very useful templates for creating financial models. I'm sure that they're available for downloading as well. On the PFAM website, there are downloads for templates of the business plan and PPT documents and so on and so forth. Most importantly, I think the resource that we really envisage you using over the next months, your coach. He's there to use and abuse. The coaching process is a two-way process. The coach needs your input as much as you need his input, and he needs your response to the coaching process. So please bear that in mind. And the coaching process can only be successful with your work at the end of the day. And you are responsible for the deliverables. The coach is an advisor and a guide. He's not creating those deliverables. I think that's it. Thank you very much. And Michael and I will be very pleased to take questions.